live now.
Let's
see. We'll see what happens. I certainly hope that someone is seeing what's going on. I can just see the people now saying, "Oh, we're a bunch of boomers. What a bunch of boomers! You can't get it together, you bunch of boomers." See, I've already got 20 people watching, apparently, which is fantastic. Hello, everybody. Wonderful too.
Okay.
Say what?
I pride myself on being a bit of a Luddite, so it's like, yeah, you're right. I don't know how to work every app because I'm not a loser.
All right, well,
I do things in the world.
Well, the people can see and hear you now, I think. So,
hello, people. I cannot see nor hear them. So I don't know if this function lets us actually see people's what's going on. I guess you let me know. I see comments, so that's interesting.
People are commenting. Hopefully, it's good stuff. We'll meander on and let people come into the chat.
Yeah, so excited to talk about Vertigo. It was nice for me to rewatch it. I mean, I'll take any excuse to rewatch a good movie because I always feel like I should be watching the movies I haven't seen that are also great as opposed to rewatching the greats. But I love to rewatch the greats because it's like you just know they're great. And especially Vertigo, is just one of those that it's so great to rewatch those kind of movies because you really do get rewarded for it. It's not just I missed something, whatever, but he creates a world that you can embody. You can kind of like join in and follow along in a way that is much deeper than just like, oh, I know the story already, so why would I rewatch it? It's not about the story per se. It's about like the experience, the feeling, the whole holistic experience that the film creates. And I just forget. I'm like, that's right. I just love being in this world that he creates. You know, there's something about that. The soundtrack also is just
wonderful. All right. Well, we'll definitely get into all that. Let's trickle in. Let people trickle in. We got 186 people watching now, which is fantastic. I see John Miller there in the chat, which is wonderful. Let's see. Now, this is my first live stream, my friends, so forgive me for being, as Ms. Sibonex, my wonderful guest, described, a Luddite. I'm not as much of a Luddite as she is. Hold on, I have a phone call coming in, which is really bizarre. Not as much of a Luddite as she is, but I'm not saying that I'm cool. So we're still trying to figure out what is going on. I want to be streaming on Twitter. It's telling me I'm live, so I'm going to view on X as well. Don't show that tip again. Let's see. Oh, nice. So we got a couple hundred people watching on Twitter, I'm not calling it X. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, friends. If we have any super Elon fans in the audience.
Like close like a browser you would close quickly if you were at work, you know, like, oh, I saw that he was on X while he was at work, you know. It's like it sounds like something that is not proper for polite society. I don't like the name, don't dig it.
All right, well, we got a pretty cool turnout here. How is it just terrible where you are? Are you? I don't want to give your location, but are you where you live right now?
I am in the city. I mean, it's okay. I if someone's able to track me down because they found out that I live in DC, then I had it coming anyway. But I am in the DC region, and it is one of the days where it's finally not summer hot. You know, not like, okay, I'm sick of summer hot. It's it cooled down slightly today, so I'm pleasantly outside. It's just like there's just a certain level of not humidity that once you hit that range, I'm just like, I like being outside again. I literally start to feel my mood change where it's like life is nice. The world is beautiful. As long as it's like under 80% humidity, it truly is like an antidepressant.
Yeah, that's tough for August in DC. The worst summer I've ever had was any time I was in August in DC. The second worst is July in New York City. Um,
Yeah.
Somehow the city ends up smelling worse at that point. At least I call DC a clean version of New York that shuts down at 9 p.m.
That's so accurate. That's so accurate.
Thank you. I feel validated now. So we got a few hundred people watching now. I guess we'll get started in earnest, and people will keep on trickling in if they enjoy it. Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and as always, everyone in between. My name is Clifton Dunk, and this is my lovely and vivacious friend Salome Sibonex, one of my favorite people on the face of the planet. I feel full of regret because there seems to be no way I can get the accent aigu on her name whenever I type it. But it is there, and maybe she can show me the keyboard shortcuts, as they say. But I have a podcast with the two of us coming out sometime this week if I can get my sloppy self together. And you and I have been friends for I don't know how. Gosh, got to be a couple of years now at this point. You know, that's the perfect reaction. And the last time we saw each other in person was in the city formerly known as New York at an event called Dissident Dialogues. And um, outside of scaring the crap out of Richard Dawkins, I also enjoyed hanging out with you for a little bit. And we both were feeling like, the whole kind of, and we'll talk about this more in the podcast that I got coming up, but the whole like influencer space, it's like a second Hollywood. A lot of really tall and somewhat, they range from interesting looking to good looking people who are looking to be famous and might be a bit narcissistic. I say this as an actor. Um, we both were like, man, it's cool. We got so many talking heads and people who want to do political commentary and these kinds of things. And we were just like, dude, let's do what we do, man. We artists, we're creatives. Um, it's so draining to be talking about politics all the time. There's so many people doing it, and it's just annoying. So we both were just like, dude, let's just do something that's fun. Let people kind of chill out. We've been talking for years about doing something together, but we're both crazy, frantic, artsy people who struggle with organization sometimes. And now we're here. We are connected, and just talking about a really, really fantastic movie. Now, I watched Vertigo for the first time probably at least a decade ago, and it didn't really hit me as much then. I think I was watching it more because I'm a huge Jimmy Stewart fan, but then I watched it on a whim a couple of weeks ago, and I texted you about it. Like then, I think it was like 4 a.m. the next morning. I was like, you have you seen this movie? We have to talk about it. It's unbelievable, and I was shocked at how much it really affected me, and so I had to talk to you about it. And so my first question, I guess, is: had you seen? You said you'd seen the film before, but when did you first encounter it? And then what was your reaction then? And then what was your reaction again upon revisiting it?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Great question. So excited. So I watched this. It's got to be. It's probably been over 5 years at least. Probably more closer to 6 or 7 since when I first saw it, and I saw it at a time when I was very much like trying to break into the arts and trying to kind of like develop more of a creative career and my own style. And so I was in that phase of artist life where you're just like consuming everything and everything is exciting and everything is inspiring and you just like you can't get enough of it. And this movie was just one of those that I was like, this is art, yes. And it was just so exciting to me. And so now I watched it again for our talk, and it was so interesting to watch it again because I remembered a lot of like that excitement that the movie first gave to me because it was so deep and there's just so much to it. And now I think I appreciated it in a different way because I was a little more mindful of the themes and I have more knowledge than I did when I was just kind of like consuming things from a more aesthetic standpoint, which is like, I like the story, I like the colors, I like the cinematography, I like the styling and all of that. Now it's like, oh wow, I see the themes of obsession, I see these themes of and identity and even obsession with identity have become themes in our own culture now, where it's kind of this, you see this in the political realm, and you see this among the left, and you see this among our whatever, your own side, where there's a lot of like fixation on like, who are those people, and there's a lot of like crossed lines also of like who we think people are, who people think they are. And so watching it for the second time felt like I went much deeper with it. And but both times it's just like, it's one of those movies I think you can watch a lot. There's many movies that are great that you don't want to necessarily watch again and again. Um and then there are the movies that are great that you can keep watching because they immerse you in a world that is timeless. And Vertigo is one of those.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You mentioned the aesthetic aspects of the film, and that's sort of where I think I want to begin, begin, so to speak, because you know we talk a lot about, or you and I have talked a lot about. And for those who don't know, Salome was my third guest ever on my podcast, so it's nice that she is making another return. But we spoke on that podcast, and I was so excited to speak to you, and just about awe and transcendence. And one thing that we also talk about a lot is beauty in our society, and how there is a campaign to basically beauty is another form of European oppression, essentially, is where we're at right now, and at least in the minds of a lot of artists. And the first thing I noticed about this film, um, as as a youngish adult, is every shot, every scene, every frame of this film is filled with beauty. And it's funny because there were some of them where it's like, that is a painting, but there were some shots where I said that looks just like a painting. And then come to find out that Hitchcock was a notorious storyboarder. He storyboarded everything, and you can see that kind of coordination throughout the film. But there were storyboards that were turned into paintings, which then became the sets that they acted on. And you see this level of detail and depth and just texture, the use of I think it's VistaVision color, the reds, the greens, and even the tailoring. The tailoring is beautiful. Kim Novak's costumes are gorgeous. Everything about this film screams craftsmanship. It screams. Scream seems like a harsh word. It exudes, right. It exudes craftsmanship. It exudes intention. It exudes form, and it's just ravishing to look at. To say nothing of Bernard Herrmann's score, which is just lush and full of these strings, and there's horns here, there's saxophones here and there at these different moments, and it's such an evocative, gorgeous piece of work. And so right off the bat, when people talk about beauty, it's not just necessarily looking at a pretty picture or a pretty woman or something like that. It's it makes me wonder about, there's that debate about, do we have an innate sense of what beauty is? And maybe it's linked to our sense of justice or morality. I don't know. But just the first thing that drew me in about the film on the second viewing was just, oh my God, this is just stunning to look at. To say nothing of, 1950 San Francisco, which is pre-excrement and junkies. And the film the city itself becomes a character in the film, and you see this different time. It's just so gorgeous. So right away I get drawn into just the sheer amount of cinematography and photography on display there.
Yeah, and what's funny is the San Francisco was very intentional, is my understanding. That I think it's Hitchcock that said, or it could have been someone else related to the film, that like San Francisco gave them a kind of like romantic Italian vibe. And it's so funny to hear that now, because that is gone from San Francisco. I've been to San Francisco recently, and it's not like you immediately get stabbed by a crackhead if you step into the city limits. Like, there's still the beautiful architecture, the beautiful nature, all of that. But it's so interesting because like there really is something about the beauty of a place And like, it's not just the aesthetics that provide that. It's not just the look. And so while the look in many ways for San Francisco is still there, it doesn't have that romantic kind of feeling. And I think, considering the theme of the film, like this idea of vertigo, to kind of be like wrapped up in this like maze, this spiral symbol, you can see how just like the structure of San Francisco as a city, with like these crazy streets that like go up hills and like these narrow roads and things like that, kind of evokes this maze like type of atmosphere. But there's something about that now, that it's like, you don't want to wander around San Francisco like the characters of this movie, and like Madeline's character wanders. That's her whole thing, is like, oh, I just wander around sometimes. And it's like, you're not gonna get very far if you're wandering around in San Francisco. Like, something's gonna break you out of your daydream very quickly. But I love your point about beauty, because there is something about how this film is not about some kind of light subject. It's not that the subject itself is beautiful. It's not like, oh, it's an inspiring, happy story. There's death, there's madness, there's tragedy, there's constant dissatisfaction through different characters throughout the film. And yet there's still something so romantic about it all. And I don't mean in the sense that we use the word now often, which is like, oh, love, but rather this kind of wistfulness, this kind of deep, meaningful human experience, that reminds us about like what it is to be alive, what it is to be human at this deepest level. Like, that to me is the kind of original sense of like what is romantic. It's to be like connected to your most to the most human experience. And so this movie has this depth to it in so many ways, like the soundtrack, like the environment, like the characters. And I think that there's something about that artistry, right? That kind of desire to be really detailed, really deep in the way that you craft something, and the way that you look at the world, honestly, because that's also what art is. Art is ultimately a reflection of the artist's worldview. You can't create something that you can't see yourself. And so you see his appreciation for like the depth of the human experience, the depth that is life in this film. And that is something that I think I always return to old movies for that, for older movies, because even though there's a lot of newer movies that do capture that, there's something distinct about the way that older films do it. They don't have to do this like tongue-in-cheek thing, or like constant breaking of the fourth wall, or constant like self-referential, like, I know I'm being romantic, but I know it, and so I just want you to know that I know it, because I'm not a rube. Like, this kind of like irony thing that a lot of later, like more postmodern era art has. Older art tends to just like very boldly go for what it's going for, as opposed to be like this ironic, I'm aware that you know that this is a movie kind of thing. Like, it doesn't do that. It lets you go in with it without having to kind of apologize for its desire to be deep. And I find this a lot now. I find that like, even in, me, we joke about like how I'll tweet something about like, oh, the leaves listening, and it just reminds me about like how there's light to be found wherever we look. And I'll have like 50 people in my tweets being like, are you on drugs? What is this shit? And I'm like, oh god, there's no understanding of depth. Like, there's no actual skill. It's a skill to be able to look for depth around you and do it in a way that's coherent, right? Not this kind of like postmodern critical theory thing, like, oh my god, the table is patriarchal because it's long. You know what I'm saying? Like, you have to be able to see the truth of reality and go deep with it. And this film is just, I just love it. I love it.
Well, you mentioned the word depth. I think we need to go into what depth really means. I think one of the things about that separates artists from everyone else is I wouldn't. I might use the word sensitivity outside as opposed to depth. There's a very. I think what we're kind of talking around is another aspect of this film, which is sort of shocking and surprising, and it dances on the knife's edge of the darker aspects of the film, which is that sure it's a murder mystery, sort of on the surface, but it's also a romance, and in a way, it's sort of an anti-romance, a very tragic romance, and what we also mentioned and we've talked about before is we have a lot of cynicism in our culture now, a lot of nihilism. People lack a sense of meaning. Everyone's guarded. Trust is lower than ever. And when you see a film like Vertigo, which is so emotive, it's so expressive on so many levels. There's a level of what's the word I'm looking for? Sincerity there, that a passion there that is unabashed and unapologetic, that I don't really see expressed as much in an era where we allow, as the playwright David Mamet once said, we allow our machines to do our dreaming for us now. We're disenchanted with our government, with the press, with academia. We're disenchanted with all these things, disillusioned. And
Yeah.
yet then there's this film like Vertigo, which is this sweeping kind of aria, and it's these two people who really, it's really a toxic, dysfunctional relationship, but at the same time, I'm sort of rooting for them. So we keep talking about depth, I suppose, and that's another thing that struck me about the movie is it's that level of sensitivity and passion and heart that's in it. It feels like a very personal film, a very emotional film, um, a very dark film. So maybe the question I have for you, because there was some commentary I was noticing, which I felt was sort of missing the point a little bit in terms of, well, here's a movie about the male gaze, and my usual rejoinder to that is, the gays have done nothing to you, leave them alone. But it's but there is something I think about we mentioned possession and obsession, and I think one of the things about the film that stands out for me, especially that Jimmy Stewart is playing this role, who sort of has this sort of all shucks avuncular persona, but he exposes a dark side, a really creepy and broken side. And I think what I wanted to know from you is, as a woman, how did you respond? Because as a man, I see this person who, there's a huge part of the film, um, scene in the film, and spoilers if you haven't seen it already, but midway through the film where there's that second death from Madeline, so to speak, and the scene afterward, he's on trial or whatever that hearing is about what happened, and there's that great monologue where this guy in a suit just tears Scotty Ferguson, or John Ferguson, aka Jimmy Stewart's character, just to shreds, calling him weak and how he didn't take any action and how he was fearful. And to me, that's a huge part of the movie. Is John Ferguson is this emasculated, weak, even impotent um, man who is held back by this deep, deep anxiety and fear. And only when he's his most alive, when this woman excites his passion in him, but it becomes mutated because he becomes obsessed with her and really possessive. And I'm like, dude, there are dudes that are like that. And then on the flip side, there are women who say, she has this line where she's like, I don't care about me anymore. In the latter half of the film, I'll do whatever you want. Why can't you love me for me? And it's so heartbreaking, even though she's kind of a scumbag. So I wanted to know your point of view on, as a woman, how you received it and what it says about maybe male and female relationships. That might be a way to get into maybe the sort of depth that we're both talking around.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's so interesting about his character is that while there are these unique elements of like the male experience, I could imagine this like drive to possess, and this also being very caught in fantasy. That's something that I think is very unique to both of their characters, but particularly the male protagonist John, because he ultimately is seeking someone that's not quite real. So his idea of who Madeline was is not really accurate, and so he's trying to recreate this fantasy woman ultimately, and it leads him to madness. And that is very much a true problem, is that when we're living by delusions, when we're not accurate in what we're trying to pursue, you're going to find yourself in problems. And that's exactly what happens to him. And so while there really is like this element of I want what I can't have type of problem for him, and the same thing is for the female character Judy. Both of them kind of want versions of themselves that they versions of the other person that they can't have. Judy wants him to love her for her, and John wants Judy to be Madeline as he imagined Madeline, and tries to make her into that. And neither of them find satisfaction by trying to do this. And so to comment on like the male experience of him, like it is really interesting because he's paralyzed by this fear, by vertigo. And the movie starts with him being kind of responsible but not really responsible, by having like survivor's guilt for the death of a fellow police officer, when he was, because he's a detective, and so he was like working with police officers and suddenly was struck with vertigo, and a cop tries to help him and falls to his death. And so he carries this kind of guilt throughout the film, the survivor's guilt, that I think is something kind of like what you're talking about. This need to be like, as a man, to be competent, to not be the cause of someone else's loss and suffering. And so
If I can jump in really quickly, there's also the element of, he keeps telling her later in the film, he goes, "Let me take care of you. Let me
yeah,
take care of you, Judy." He wants to take care of somebody. He wants to have that role.
yes, exactly. So you kind of see this desire for him to fulfill this more traditional masculine role as like a competent provider and someone that does not cause suffering to people around him. But what's so fascinating is like he has this other female character right there from the beginning. Barbara, I think, is the name of the character. Or it might be the actress. I might be confusing them.
Yeah,
But
it's Barbara Del Geddes. It's Bel Geddes, and the character's name is Midge.
okay, Midge, right? I'm thinking of the actress. So Midge is right there. She wants to be with him. He could be that figure for her. She's in love with him, but he just doesn't see her that way. He gets caught up and like pulled into this fantasy world. And there's something really particularly male gaze, if you want to take it that way, about the driving scene, which is just like there's something so just intrinsically human in many ways, but particularly the male experience of like pursuit. This is long been agreed upon that like that's part of the problems of having a long-term relationship as a man, and in a couple, whatever, is you've got to keep the spark alive. Well, why? Because men are very driven by like pursuit. What's next? What's coming down the pipes type of thing. And so you see this element in the movie where he's like constantly pursuing this woman. And of course, it's under the guise of like, I'm trying to protect her, I'm doing detective work, but he falls in love with her through this pursuit. And I think that's very a natural kind of story in that way. But you also see him neglecting this very real potential relationship right in front of him, and at one point hurting the woman Midge, because she thinks he's with this other woman. She drives by and sees the woman leaving, and she's kind of like, oh, hope it was good for you type of thing. And so that's kind of sad. You have this woman, right, like waiting in the wings, like in love with him. Apparently they were engaged for a short amount of time, and then it didn't work, and he kind of like is like, oh yeah, that went that way. And she's just kind of like, it could be not that way. Like we could make it work, but he's just not there. And so there's something a little bit almost immature about that. There's something that's not quite that's not actually very responsible about his character, that allows him to get so wrapped up in this fantasy pursuit that actually leads to the death of these two women. And so there's a question there of, is he, because of his propensity to get so wrapped up in these kind of like fantasies and the pursuit, is he actually being more negligent and failing to have that kind of like mature provider role, because of him being so wrapped up in these like fantasy pursuits? And then you have the female side of that, which is Judy, who is like really kind of a tragic character in her, how much she wants him to love her, but he wants to be with this woman that doesn't even really exist anymore, quite literally, Madeline. And so she allows him to change her into this other person, and kind of like try to make herself his fantasy, which is not at all an unusual story, despite it being very dramatized in this and like very done up. That is a pretty common experience, I think, for a lot of both men and women. This idea of like, if I can just be who they want, then we can have this happy life that I'm envisioning. And it never works out that way. And it also does not work out that way in the film. It actually leads to her death. And that's such a fascinating development, right? For this character to submit to his kind of obsessive fantasies and say, I'll let you make me a different person, which quite literally culminates in her not being a person anymore.
Well, I would say what's even on top of that, which is interesting, is that that final scene. I mean, and I love Jimmy Stewart so much, and people talk about Marlon Brando, but Stewart was was giving some naturalistic performances before Brando came on the scene. And what's great is that you mentioned earlier in the film where it's essentially stalking. He's being paid to stalk this woman, but just the way that he looks at her. When he has no dialogue, there's someone that said that Hitchcock is a fan of pure cinema, which is moving pictures without words. And when you have an actor of Stewart's caliber, you can always look for what's happening behind the eyes. You can always see something active behind the eyes. And the way that he dotes on her, like, first of all, the scene really, the movie really began to weird me out right after she jumps in the bay and he takes her to her house. I'm like, hold on. Because Hitchcock is brilliant, right? He takes the time to pan the camera around his apartment, and you can see her clothes strewn up about. And I was like, wait a second. She was, out cold. He stripped her naked. He put her in his bed, and it's never it's never shown or it's talked about like what they did. But there's that moment where the phone rings in his room and he picks it up and she's startled and looks at him. There's that quick charged moment of like, what the hell am I doing here? Who are you? What's going on? And then they both kind of decide to allow the interaction to continue. So there's this weird, but again, I'm just like, what? This is hella creepy already. But then later on, I think what's interesting is that if the story ends once he rediscovers his virility in a way. He solves the crime. He sort of resumes his role as detective and hero. And Stewart, he's so known for this kind of aw shucks persona, but in that last scene, he's so aggressive, he's so violent, and he's like, "This is the truth." And he has this killer line. He just delivers it perfectly, where he's like, because for those who haven't seen the film, he figures it out when he sees a necklace that was worn in this painting. Like it's a whole thing. I'm not going to get into it. It's kind of a plot hole, but it's fine. But he has this line where he said, you shouldn't keep souvenirs from a murder, and he says you shouldn't have been so sentimental. He barks this line at her, and as he's like dragging her up these stairs, and he gets to the very top of these stairs, and he says, "I made it, I made it." And so he beats his acrophobia and his vertigo. He rediscovers. He's able to reassert himself, at least in the physical sense, and maybe his purpose in life as an officer. He's able to reassert himself as a man. And once he reaches that pinnacle, what happens right after that? She dies. So I think that's an interesting sort of. I thought about it. I hadn't thought about it in those terms before, but it's as though I wonder what that says. That once the Ferguson character rediscovers who he is as a man, perhaps. Just a theory. Um, and then the chick has to die.
But that's what I mean about these two figures, both Madeline and Judy, being representative of kind of like destructive fantasies. This is like, and it really goes with like the Vertigo motif, the soundtrack. You have this kind of like lilting, everything is not quite what it seems. You're getting drawn in further and further into this upside down world where you think you know what's going on and then it shifts and whatever. And it's so interesting because the contrast of anytime he's around Midge, is so much more real. Like suddenly when he's talking to her or in that apartment with her, she is what she is, and it very much feels like this is the real world. But then whenever he's with Judy or pursuing Madeline, it becomes this like fantasy world where it's a mystery, and it's like he's trying to figure out either who is Madeline, what is going on, or how can I make Judy into Madeline and then I'll be free. Then like things will be normal. And it's like, well, that's not how things become normal. First of all, you don't make your girlfriend into some other girl to be normal. So that's the whole thing is upside down when he's in that kind of like pursuing these fantasies realm. And so I really do think there's something about like a death of these characters as a kind of like symbolic thing. It's a symbolic device for him being free of these obsessions, of these like fantasies and delusions in some cases.
But I wonder, just to pop in really quick, I wonder if it's a specifically male fantasy though, because there's a line in the film which stood out to me the first time when I revisited it a few weeks ago, and it's the scene in the shop where that brilliant French actor is giving the sort of backstory about Carlotta Valdez, the alter ego of Madeline, for those who haven't seen the film, and he has this line where he says, he's talking about the past, and he says, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, back in those days, um, women could men could throw away women back in those days. Like he could just do that, just like a piece of. I'm still paraphrasing, but there was this line that just really was. And again, the actor is brilliant because I think he sensed that was an important line. So he gives space around it the way he delivers it. In terms, he pauses a little bit before and then afterward a little bit to let it sink a little bit. But it's just this line about, he threw away Carlotta Valdez. A man could do that back in those days, and a couple of centerpiece scenes in the film involve a woman getting literally thrown away.
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah, there's something about that. I do think, considering just like what the film is all about, that fantasy element as a path towards destruction, um, is very, very real. And it is a kind of like a fascinating thing because I love the exploration of this topic of obsession and how it's both something that's very exciting and feels rewarding even as a viewer, right? It's more fun and interesting to watch the character become obsessed and pursue these women in that like frenzied way than it is to watch him being reasonable and trying to say, oh no, Midge, I'm fine, and like, just sitting around in the apartment. Like there's such a contrast, both in his behavior and kind of your experience as the viewer watching him. And that obsessive quality is, I mean, it's known to be a destructive force. It's like one of the things that you hear in art echoed throughout history, just like the dangers of obsession, the dangers of going too deep into something, even if that thing is desirable and enjoyable in some regard. And I think this film kind of, it takes you down that road in a way that's fun, but it also releases you in a way that's cathartic.
Well, there's also an element of, you say when someone is obsessed by something, you could also say that they're haunted by it. And I think that that's an interesting underlying sort of motif in the film is, it begins with, oh, you should follow my wife because I think she's possessed by this,
Yes.
whatever. And, but then Stewart's character ends up becoming possessed, obsessed with, haunted by the specter of this woman, even before she dies, but certainly after she dies. And it really it really eats him up, and he can't move on from that. So maybe he can't move on from it, and it's what keeps him from it keeps him disconnected or divorced from his, I'm going to go back to this phrase of his masculine strength, maybe his balls. um yeah, I don't know, there's something about, like, Midge has a line about, was she a ghost, or was it fun, or whatever that line is. And I think about that because there is an element of, when you are being in love, it really is kind of a form of being possessed in some sense, especially that first one, boy. Whew. You just
All been,
that is.
we all been listen, I've had my Vertigo Jimmy Stewart moments. Like, I'm not even gonna
Well, you
go
be
into
dragging bitches up the stairs and throwing them out of windows.
I will admit to no crimes publicly, but I remember being just a little bit younger. Okay, let's give me some room by saying I was young, but literally just being like obsessed with an ex or a partner to the point that it's like, I'm just gonna drive past their house to see if they happen to be home. I just want to see. I just want to know. Just see if they're home. I'll just show up. I'll just show up. Like, it's not crazy. Well, it is crazy, but it's not uncommon. It's not.
You telling on yourself right now.
I love the movie, and it's not for no reason. I relate. Like, there's something very, very normal, like a very it's actually quite a normal experience to be a human and just to get obsessed with a person that you think is your person. It's like, oh, this is the person for me. Like, I just love them. I'm obsessed with them. Like, once I'm with them, that'll be it. And it's so easy for us as human beings to get wrapped up in other people, and that's something that's also very very interesting about this movie, because I particularly liked how much there's a wishy-washiness about who all these people actually are. Because Madeline is both Madeline, but also potentially possessed by the spirit of another person. And Judy is not quite Judy because she's pretending to be Madeline at some parts. And the friend of Jimmy Stewart, who tells him, like, hey, can you follow around my wife, is also not being honest about what he's interested in. And so you have this kind of like constant confusion around who exactly are you in relationship with? Who exactly is this person? Do you really know who it is that you're in relationship with? And that's a fascinating thing, because it's like when he first gets to see Judy, and he's like, catches her in the street and follows her to her hotel room, and it's like, you remind me of someone. And there's this sense that he's found her, like he thinks he's found Madeline in a way, but then he realizes, I've got to change some things. Like, you got to do this, you got to change your hair, you got to change your clothes. And so it's not exactly who he thought she was. Like, he has to do these other things to make her into who he wants her to be. And so that is such a common experience as a human being. It's like when we first try to date someone and we think like, oh, I think they're like this. And if they're like this, then we'll be like this together. And then our life will be like this. And then as you continue to get to know that person, you're like, ooh, you're not actually like that. You're a little more like this. And maybe we're not exactly matched. And so that process of questioning, like, do you actually know who it is that you're pursuing, is just such a great human question, because again, it comes back to that depth that everybody is not just this cookie cutter, like one dimensional personality. People are very much multidimensional. And this film does exactly that. It's like you think this person is this, but then it's actually someone pretending to be that person, or it's actually someone who is acting out some other persona in their mind. And that is just like, I love that. It's so human.
Well, there is something about how, I go back to this idea of how divorced he is from his true purpose, and how dysfunctional he is as a result. Um,
Mm.
Something that I also thought of, as you were speaking, it was really interesting, and it went completely out of my head, and I forgot what it was. Um, maybe I'll find it at some point. There's something about truth, about, well, maybe there's something about the going back to the idea of it being a male gaze kind of movie. I was struck when I rewatched the film. That first sequence. First of all, I mean, again, a gorgeous sequence where they're in Ernie's restaurant. These sweeping, beautiful red plush walls. The camera pans across. You see all these well-dressed people, and then you see this emerald green dress in the corner of the room. So your eye goes right there, and of course, it's the Novak character. She rises from the chair. She walks toward the camera, and she's in profile. And while she's in profile, the music swells. These strings swell up, and you see she kind of gets a halo surrounding her, and it cuts to Jimmy Stewart kind of turning away a little bit. And so no words are spoken, but something very emotional has happened. Like there's some event that's just happened, I think. And I think that's the beginning of his idealization of her. Going back to this idea that he's not really falling in love with her. He's falling in love with this romanticized ideal of who she is. And I guess it gets me to this, maybe one of the last things I want to talk about, which is, I wonder if a film like this could be made today. One, someone with the meticulous attention to craft and detail as Hitchcock, being able to assemble. I mean, that cast from top to bottom, even the minor actors in that film are wonderful, and totally embody the characters that they've been asked to play. But it kind of circles back to near the beginning of our conversation, which is cynicism and the sense of vulnerability. And we've talked in our private conversations about one of the things that seems to be missing. And I've been absorbing a lot of content lately, which has been really depressing in terms of the dating market right now. People are very, very unhappy in a lot of ways for a lot of reasons. And I look at a film like Vertigo, and I say, I wonder if it could be made today, because despite all of the darkness underneath it, it is on some level a love story and a romance. And I wonder if the film could be made today, not because of all the usual stuff we talk about of, oh, it's the wokies, they can't do anything right, I hate them. But is it an extension of the fact that we have such a cynical and guarded, jaded culture now? Could we, with this, I mean, the movie, I think it had a sort of a mixed reception, not mixed, but maybe a muted reception when it came out, and it's only gained in popularity in subsequent years. But I wonder if one of the reasons I was so struck by it, and maybe you felt this too, was just that, every work of art is a labor of love. Every great work of art is a labor of love. And if you have a culture which, in which love is complicated or obfuscated by, it might be politics, it might be, money concerns, whatever it is. It's like you're not allowed to be in love anymore. You're not allowed to be genuine or open-hearted or sincere. And that's why I go back to this line about, you shouldn't have been so sentimental. Because to me, that's like that's a hard freaking line. And I wonder if that's kind of another, not lesson, but maybe a takeaway from the film, is this maybe juxtaposed with our current culture, our films made for a modern audience. It's like, it's like we can't do romance anymore, like true romance or true connection, because the film doesn't, as dark as the film is, it doesn't work if you don't believe that those two characters couldn't live without each other. And both of the actors are so wonderful playing with each other, and they built this relationship so They build those relationships so wonderfully. And that, and his relationship with Midge, when I get excited, I start talking quickly. His relationship with Midge, as you pointed out, they were engaged. It was a broken engagement. And I think it's interesting that, you see her in the first scene where, she's got a career and she's designing bras and women's underwear, and she's able to kind of give as good as she gets as far as banter. And it's a woman that he can't control, which is interesting. And he has no interest in her, or maybe mild interest in her. But then this fantasy comes along and he's just totally gets swept away by it. And maybe there's something tragic in that this older man allows himself to be swept away by this. And but he had to experience immense pain and tragedy and come out on the other end and say, you shouldn't have been so freaking sentimental. Maybe that's part of the idea. So I guess, that's a long-winded way of saying, like, could a film be made today on a craftsperson level? We're being politically correct all of a sudden. And also in terms of our ability to convey and embrace love and romance.
Dude, I don't even think Woody Allen is allowed to make films in the United States anymore. I'm pretty sure that he has to go get his films produced and made in other countries now, because American film production companies won't do it, because they're like, oh, no, you're too, like tainted or whatever. Of course, other countries' film productions don't give a shit. They're like, are you a criminal? Are you like actively running away from the law? Okay, no, then your private mess is not my business. So he makes his films with foreign film productions. So all that to say, Woody Allen is probably one of the contemporary filmmakers, or at least recent contemporary filmmakers, that still keeps that kind of like idealism and romanticism in his movies, and he cannot make films here. So I think that's that gives a good answer. Obviously, you say, oh well, that's his particular political situation or whatever. But that also speaks to what the priorities of film production companies are here, and it's very often like risk reduction, which is like, good job, good luck trying to make good art if your highest priority is like risk reduction. And so one, a lot of the films that get made now, while there's gems that come out every now and then, and there's also unique films. It's not to say that like, oh, there are no good films now. Like, I'm not that kind of person. Like, good films do get made, but they're not like that. They're not films about like that have like a romantic thread. They're not films that do this kind of that have that idealism in them still. This is a dark film. Like, Vertigo is a dark film, but there's something still like kind of idealistic about it in a way. There's something, like you said, it really is a film that believes in love. And it's a film that's like wildly bold and open in how it like just lays bare the uglier parts of our inner selves, like the obsession, the like, I'll let you make me into someone if you'll just love me, like that kind of shit that it's like, oof, I don't want to, don't look at me, I would never do that, that kind of thing that makes us all be like, ooh, but I relate, that kind of shit. That requires such a level of sincerity. And I do think that because our culture is in this like really, how can I say, like fragile, low trust climate where everybody's just ready to go for the lowest hanging fruit and be like, oh, this is objectifying women, oh, this is patriarchal, blah blah blah. You have these like loud voices where it really has kind of like chilled art in multiple different realms, where it's now people are a little more nervous to bare their hearts like that. And I really think that we underestimate how much that's real, how much artists can be influenced in a culture by that chill of of a wider culture that's like just won't tolerate sincerity because too many people have their pitchforks out ready to prove that like I'm a good person because I can tell you what's wrong with everything around me. Don't look at me though, nothing wrong with me, but let me point out everything that's wrong with everybody around me. And so that's killer for art. That's just poison, that kind of climate. And a movie like that, no one would have made this. Like, I don't think if a young Hitchcock came to the studios and was like, "Here's the movie I want to make," I really think they would have fucking laughed and been like, "Are you, first of all, this is crazy. I'm like, I don't even know what this is. This doesn't even make any sense. Where is the superhero or whatever?" Like, and second of all, no one's gonna want to see this because there's abuse, you know, blah blah blah, all these things. Like, it's just we have gotten to a place where we're so much more concerned about being politically correct and like making sanitized things, especially in like the mainstream arts where people it's absurd to me, but like we seem to have regressed to a point where people think that art is supposed to be propaganda that shows you how people should act. And so you'll have commentary like, oh, why did they make the black character the villain? That's wrong because that sends a message that black people are villains. How will how will kids look at this and think? And then of course, if you don't put any black person as a villain, then they say, oh, they never cast a black person as a villain. You know, it's just always trying to use these different political cudgels to criticize and tear things down. And it creates a climate where like you can't make things that go deep. You can't make things that have this like profound level of sincerity because we can't even get there. There's no hunger for it. There's no tolerance for it. I think now you just find it in like you don't find it in films. Like you can find more of it in music. Um, you can find more of it in perhaps writing and things like that. Things that don't take millions of dollars to make. That's the problem with a lot of film is that you have to have this like huge budget team and you have so many people that are working together and they're working for like over a
Oh, well, looks like we lost. We lost Salome. Hopefully we'll see her. We'll see her return. I did not kick her out. I think she saw herself out, or maybe her Wi-Fi saw itself out. But she said something about people wanting to. A lot of filmmakers today, maybe entertainment professionals, writers, they release a lot of films about how people should act. And what's courageous is not to say, you know, I mean, there is an element of all stories, right? This is the right moral thing to do. The good guy usually wins in the end. This is how we should act as a society and as people. But there's, you know, there's creating something to talk about how, you know, to socially engineer society or to engineer society. So this is how people should act versus having the courage to say this is how people do act. And one of the things about this film, which I think is interesting, is that, and why, if you come at it from a, you know, this is a male gaze kind of a thing or a shallow, um, ideal political perspective, part of the problem is that here she comes. We won't tell her how badly we were talking about her while she was away. I can't believe her. How dare she? There is a, if there's a if you have a superficial analysis that just talks about, you know, male oppression or the male gaze, you also miss that. For me, I'm watching it and I'm uncomfortable because, you know, you mentioned Salome. Welcome back, by the way. Thanks for joining us again. You mentioned, you know, this idea of, I mean, it is a male gaze movie in a way, but this idea of like, you know, I don't care about myself. I'm going to sacrifice myself or, you know, I think she says, I'll give you what you want, which is such a specific line
yeah.
for a woman to say, I think, you know, and there's a, oh shoot, I forgot what I was going to say. There's a, you know, there's an element of the film where, you know, if you're only looking at it from, you know, I saw one commentary analysis that was something like, you know, it was about Midge and how, you know, a strong, independent woman, da 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 da. He don't work, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, but at the same time, Midge is someone who she's a beautiful character because I mean she's yearning for love, and she tries her best to go and pursue it in the best way she knows how, but it's doomed to failure. And what's ironic about that is, again, it goes back to this idea of this sort of weak, impotent male who, I mean, she's literally cradling him and saying, "Mommy's here." So she becomes his mother in a way. So there's things about the film. You said, oh, I can relate. I'm like, yeah, there is an aspect of this male character who has lost his virility and he's being doted on by this other adult woman, and and the idea of taking control, taking possession of this woman, idolizing her, worshiping her, wanting her to be dependent on you, to take care of you. I think you could make there's enough like discomfort, about men and how we are as well in this film. And if you're just looking at it from like, oh, it's about control or it's about obsession, then you kind of miss that. So it goes back to this idea of maybe you didn't hear this during your pee break, but it's about how a lot of politically correct art is about how people should act and wants to tell you how people should act, but it doesn't have the courage to say this is how people do act. Yeah, it is messed up that there are a lot of women who,
Yeah.
they want to be taken care of, so to speak, or led along, and they will allow themselves to be made over or to be molded, as it were. There are a lot of men who, maybe it's an expression of his own his impotence in other aspects of his life drive him to try and control this woman. I mean, I'm theorizing right now, but maybe it just goes back to this idea. You mentioned hunger, and tolerance. When I was in grad school, one of the aspects of our training was about, you have to develop an appetite. There's a certain point as an artist where you have to decide what kind of artist you're going to be, and you have to develop an appetite for the really uncomfortable, dark places that we don't want to go. And the great Tony Kushner, the playwright and screenwriter, once told us that audiences, they're really just paying to watch you suffer. That's really what it is. Comedy is just suffering with timing. And if you're I don't think you can make a film like Vertigo if you don't have some scars on your soul and you're not willing to be honest about some of the darker aspects of who we are. Someone, I think it was Johnny Villar, in our comments said that line that I was referencing earlier. If I can find it, to scroll upward. But we have over 1,000 people watching. This is fantastic. Thanks everybody for joining. Make sure to hit that thumbs up and the like to boost this stream. Although we'll be closing shortly, so you can get on with the rest of your night and get on tomorrow. Get to work tomorrow, or whatever it is that you do. Maybe you don't work. Maybe you
Drive
are
around.
you're vigilante or something, and you on the streets of Chicago. Don't get shot. The line is, a man could do that sort of thing. He had the power, the freedom. Such an interesting line. And for me, I'm like, just like you said, I'm like, yo, I relate to that. I'm gonna be straight up honest with you. I relate to that in terms of like, like it reminds. This is the last thing I'll say, but it reminds me of the scene late in Othello where Amelia, who's Iago's wife, is bathing Desdemona, who's Othello's wife, and she knows that she's pretty much about to die. But Amelia, she's older, she's wiser, she's a little bit more grizzled. And I'm paraphrasing again, but she has these lines about how these men they eat us up, they fill us up, and they fill their stomachs up with us, and then they belch us out again. And I'm like, yo, that's some real shit. But it's messed up. But you want to have, I don't know, man, this is a really long ramble, but it's just, this idea of this, I guess I go back to this authenticity or the sincerity, the courage to be truthful about who we are, even if we don't like the aspects of ourselves that these sort of things reveal. I think there's something, if these darker aspects of ourselves are delivered in a vehicle that is as beautiful as Vertigo, it gives us that sense of awe and transcendence that we talk about. It helps us overcome the cynicism that we talked about. it examines, we examine our own wounds in our lives, our own personal traumas that we've experienced, our own relationships and our broken, maybe failed loves. Um, I have this theory of called compound affect, where if you take something that's ugly in a piece of art and you beautify it, either with poetry or great cinematography, beautiful music, and what happens is that the thing is still ugly, but the ugliness is amplified, but the beauty and the emotional impact is also amplified. It's compounded when it's joined with something beautiful. And I think that's sort of why Vertigo got me so much, is that it's a gorgeous, gorgeous film aesthetically. It's ugly psychologically, but those things coming together really combine to just it sweeps you off its feet, and it really, it hit me in the gut, which is why I texted you at 4 a.m. saying we got to talk about this movie.
Was like, that is a very, I just watched 4 a.m. text, like, now. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that is one of the incredible achievements of this movie, is taking something that otherwise we'd be like, well, you better keep that locked in the closet. That's a skeleton. That's not something that we want to own as like, oh, I'm just like him. It's not an ideal. It's not something that we're necessarily proud of in ourselves. But when you see it played out in myth, in story, and in that kind of like Hitchcock cinematic poetry, where it's framed in these beautiful sets and clothing and just language and music, and all of this kind of makes it a living myth that we can kind of enter into, along with these characters that are going to suffer and are kind of like in these dark, otherwise embarrassing moments. Like, that's not something you'd ever want to be proudly parading around as like, oh, I was so broken that I told a man that he could just make me into some ex and I would accept it because I just wanted his love so badly. Those are those low moments that no one wants to own. But when they're put into this kind of vehicle, it it gives us enough appreciation for how human these experiences are, and couples it with enough sugar that we're willing to take the medicine that is, this is real. This is what it is to be a human. Sometimes it's to go a little crazy and to embarrass yourself and to almost self-destruct in the pursuit of your fantasies or your desires. And it's a lot easier to confront that in a kind of like beautiful vehicle like art. It's why it's so important for us to be able to have art that does this. And why it's so misguided to think that art is supposed to show us just like model citizens or be politically correct or be sanitized and all these kind of things, or that art should ever just be some other person's preferences. That's also just not how art works. You can go make your own art if you really, really want to see something played out. Great, go make it. As opposed to thinking like someone else's art is a problem because they didn't play out the fantasy that you wanted to see in there. And so this movie is just, it's one of my favorites. It remains, after so many years now watching it again, it's just like, okay, yeah, I realize why it was so impactful for me at the time. It does exactly what you described. It's just like, it's like it couples the ugly with the beautiful in a way that is so thrilling to us, I think, as humans, because that's the stuff that we don't want to own. That's exactly the kind of stuff that we'd rather not look in the face, and particularly that we don't want to think we have anything in common with. But when you put it into these beautiful vehicles that is art, it makes us so much more willing to be honest about what it is to be human. And that just leads to more good art and to more authentic experiences, like a more authentic being of ourselves, if we're not afraid to actually be honest about the messy parts of being a human being. It's so great. It's a wonderful movie to reconnect to that, and to watch this guy go kind of crazy and make a fool of himself in so many ways, and then see this character arc where he does come out on the other end with his power back and being able to kind of like put himself back in control after going down this like downward spiral craziness.
Well, downward, so to speak. And hearkening back to the discussion much earlier about San Francisco, you'll notice that a lot of scenes take place while he's stalking her. They're going downhill a lot, so it's like they're spiraling downward. It's such smart filmmaking from a cinematic perspective. Well, we've been here for just over an hour. We have over 1,100 people watching, which is way more than I expected. So friends, listen, let me know in the comments. I see there's a bunch of wonderful discussion going on. I think it's such a wonderful and smart, brilliant community of people, and it pleases me to no end. So let me know what you think in the comments. Salome and we've been wanting to do something together for a long time on a weekly basis. So I think we were talking about doing these every Tuesday, as opposed to Wednesday. And so, you know, neither of us have streamed before. We'll get better as we stumble through. Next week actually is what's that date? The 20th. We spoke about talking about Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" as a piece of as a sort of a perfect piece of social commentary. You know, social commentary done right. So yeah, you let us know. We're thinking about, I see Jess in the comments asking, is this a regular thing on X? Thank you. Yeah, we want it to be a regular thing. And we were talking about, and again, I have a podcast with the two of us coming out tomorrow. We talked about this. You know, we're sort of over being lumped in with a lot of the more sort of rambunctious political influencers. That's really not our bag. That's not our thing. We're both sensitive, weepy artist type. We prefer talking about culture, and you have two really cool, sophisticated people talking about it. And I see Kona has just pissed on my parade by saying, for future reference, the counter is how many I've seen the stream, not live viewers. Wah wah, but that's fine. You know, this is a new thing, and it's really all about giving people a place just on a weeknight, work night, to kind of unwind and hear people ramble about different aspects of culture. We'll talk about movies, talk about music, whatever we decide to come up with. Maybe leave some suggestions in the comments so we can talk about. But yeah, let me know if you enjoyed this, and leave me a thumbs up. As we go on, you know, I'll be more active in the chat, because again, there's so many great comments and so much great commentary. You people are so freaking smart. I feel so humbled. Gosh, I think that is pretty much everything. Go and see Vertigo if you've not seen it. Salome, how can people find you if they wish to find you?
Yeah, best thing is to just find me on Twitter or Instagram at Salome Sibonex. Just my name. It should be available somewhere in the show. I guess you added me or something like that. And it's also spelled here on the screen. And Twitter and Instagram are the best. I also write for a publication called The Black Sheep, which is an ode to individualism in a time of crazy collectivism. So if that resonates with you, find that on Substack, wetheblacksheep.com.
Fantastic. Had myself muted. This is my first ever stream. I'm just kidding. Well, it is my first stream, but yeah, you know, people in the comments, I love it. Trembling Colors talking about art and culture is infinitely more important than politics and drama. Johnny, again, with all the bangers this evening. Yes, these are the artistic conversations that we must be having. So again, I'm glad that there's so many people who feel like we do. They're kind of tired of people, you know, screaming on podcasts about all kinds of things, you know, which there's a place for that, but there's also a place for talking about pieces of art. Jess, Best Hitchcock, Rear Window. Would love a combo about it. We see that. We see you. I love me some Jimmy Stewart. Grace Kelly is so beautiful in that movie. Raymond Burr is amazing, and like in his little screen time there. Gosh, what else is there to say? You can find me on YouTube at Clifton Duncan. You can find the Clifton Duncan podcast, which I upload very irregularly. You can find my newsletter, which is the State of the Arts, which I also upload irregularly. You can find me on Twitter at Clifton A. Duncan. And what else is there? I'm not good at plugging myself, but This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm glad that we were able to have a good time. I'm really bad at goodbyes, so I would just say good night, everyone. Salome, it's always wonderful to see you, and I see it's getting dark out, so you need to get inside as well. So I'll see you next Tuesday. Oh, that's a well. I'll see you. Well, I shall see you next week on the day of Tuesday. We don't want to say see you next Tuesday. That means something else.
Oh, does it?
Oh, see you next Tuesday. You never heard that?
No, is that a thing?
Okay, so no one tell Salome what that is. Let her look it up on her own. And for now, everybody. Say what?
I think I'd like to remain innocent. I don't know if I want to know this.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the end of the world if you don't know it. But friends, ladies, gentlemen, as always, everyone in between, it was wonderful spending the evening with you, and we will see you next week, next Tuesday, where we'll be talking about Marvin Gaye's classic album, What's Going On.
So good. Everybody listen to it so that when you join, you are freshly inspired from having listened to the album. Also, just a great excuse to sit back and listen to a whole album like we once did back in the day instead of just listening to single songs all shuffled together.
Yeah, and it's like 48 minutes long, and the album just flows together. You can listen to it in one sitting. It's a work of genius. All right, friends, have a good night. Make good choices. Take care of yourselves, and good night. Bye. And the stream has ended. Well, that happened.